Hello, I'm Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University and founder of the American Principles Project. I'm your host for Candidate Conversations. Candidate Conversations 2016 features in-depth one-on-one conversations with 2016 presidential candidates on all the important issues of moral and constitutional principle facing American Catholics and our fellow citizens today. Our guest on this edition of Candidate Conversations is former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. Governor, welcome.
Thank you very much,
Wonderful
Dr.
to be
George.
here with you.
Really a delight. I've looked forward to this for quite some time.
You know, Governor, our viewers are pro-life and pro-marriage people, and I know that they share my admiration for everything that you, this is not an endorsement, but it is an expression of the truth, the admiration that we all have for your pro-life and pro-family witness, not just in this campaign, of course, but over many, many years. I'd like to begin by asking you a question about our nation's ideals, or really our civilization's ideals. What do you think the fundamental ideals of our civilization are? Are they under threat today? And what can we do to protect them?
Well, they're very much under threat. The underpinnings of our civilization really are, first of all, natural law, the law that God puts into our heart, the law that is obvious to everyone, that it is wrong to murder, that it is wrong to steal, that there are certain things that we innately know. And I think natural law is something that we have historically always believed was the basis of even our man-made law, but it was still based on the idea of natural law. In the United States, when our founders created this remarkable constitutional republic, they leaned upon natural law. They understood that that was the foundation. They recognized that our basic rights and freedoms didn't come from the government. The government didn't have the power to grant them. The government only had the power to try to protect them and preserve them. And so if one reads those documents, whether it's the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, the Federalist Papers, it becomes very evident that our founders were in awe of the idea that they were the trust keepers of this magnificent notion, which I think is the beginning. We have natural law, we have man law, and we have family. And I think those are the three fundamental pillars upon which we are based. The idea that a family is the most basic unit of government, and it is the first unit of government to which all of us are introduced. It's where we learn what I would call the most rudimentary understandings of how to behave with each other.
Really, it sounds as though the argument is that the family is the first unit of society, not just of government, but of an overall society. Yeah.
Well, even in the biblical order, God created the family before He created the institutions of civil government or the church. So if we want to look at it in terms of a priority that God set, family does precede everything else. Without a stable family, there can't be a stable civil government or a stable church or stable anything. It means that the civilization will crumble.
Is that because all the other institutions of society, the economic institutions, the political institutions, the legal institutions, depend on the family to produce people who are basically honest, decent, law-abiding, willing to make sacrifices for others and so forth, since obviously economic institutions and political institutions can't do that?
It's absolutely why. I mean, we could never afford a big enough government that would take that role and responsibility for every person born and teach them the fundamental things that you must share, you must wait your turn, you must respect others, you can't hit people. I mean, things that we learned in the sandbox, if not the crib. And all of those basic lessons are a part of the way that we not only create the next generation, but then we train the next generation to become our replacements. Self-government is really the highest form of government. I sometimes marvel that people have never thought this through, but the reason we have so much civil government today, the reason that we have shelf after shelf of law books, is because we are constantly having to redefine the extent of law to interpret what should have been simple, and it would have been had we lived under that basic one law that supersedes all, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. If we all lived under that one law, then we wouldn't have any need to have a law against domestic violence, murder, burglary, speeding, drug addiction, all those things, because we would never do any of those things to another. We wouldn't rape another. I mean, we wouldn't want to be raped. We wouldn't want to be stolen from. We wouldn't want to be hit in the head with a hammer. I look at all the different things we don't want done to us, and if we simply said, I will treat others as if I wanted others to treat me, that's self-government in its essence. And frankly, our whole culture was designed so that we would self-govern And the more and the degree to which we self-govern, the less we have to depend upon civil government to restrain us, control us, and even isolate us from the rest of the population when we don't behave.
I like to say that the family is the original and best Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
Well said.
But of
Yeah.
course, when the family disintegrates, especially when there's widespread family disintegration, then those health, education, and welfare functions are going to have to be taken over by somebody.
Sure.
If the family's not there to do it, somebody else will do it. And of course, in the end, it will be the government. The government will not do it well because the government cannot do it well. The government can't know a child by name. It can only make general rules for people in general. It can't deal with the specifics, and you and I both have children, and we know how different one child is from the other.
Yes.
And you need a kind of custom tailoring of how you nurture a child, given the child's particular strengths or vulnerabilities, sensitivities, and so forth. But still, those health, education, and welfare functions have to be taken up by somebody. If the family disintegrates, the government will do it, and so you get the growth of government, not only to provide those services, but because the government will not be able to do it very well, you will have the rise of various pathologies, delinquency, drug abuse, despair, violence ultimately, crime, incarceration, and then people have to pay the costs of those human tragedies in terms of increased policing, penal institutions, and so forth, all of which, again, grows government and raises the tax burden.
When people who are on the conservative side say, I just want to cut taxes and lower the size of government, I say that's terrific, but just keep in mind that the best way to do that is to have a moral population, a population that is self-governing, self-controlled, because the degree to which we don't have that is the degree to which people are going to say, we need more cops on the streets.
Sure.
We need more jails. We need to put these people away. Okay, well, somebody's got to pay for that. I was a governor for 10 and a half years, and before that a lieutenant governor, presided over the state senate. The one thing I learned was the size of government was directly proportionate to people's unwillingness to self-govern. And the very people who wanted less government wanted more government as soon as someone began to in any way impede their liberties. So then they said, I want an agency or a board or...
There ought to be a law.
There ought to be a law.
Yeah.
And there would be. Somebody would be more than willing to accommodate them. And that's why we have such a proliferation of law. But it really goes back to, as we further disjoin ourselves from this notion of natural law, and I go back to that point, because there are people who think that our country can operate in a moral vacuum. It can't. There are people who think that even the discussion of moral issues is inappropriate, that we should leave those alone. I've had people who told me, I'm not going to give to your campaign. I'd like to help you, but I'm not, because you keep pushing these moral things. And what they're talking about, of course, is marriage and sanctity of life,
yeah.
and other issues. But they say, I don't want to hear all that moral stuff. We just need to focus on the economy. I'm thinking, well, you can't focus on the economy if you separate that from the lives that we live as citizens, because the degree to which we disobey natural law and even man law is the degree to which we're going to end up with more law.
I think that the problem with libertarianism really is that it's half right.
Yeah.
There's a profound bit of truth in the libertarian position. The problem is it doesn't see the other half of the equation, which is the importance of the moral order.
I would love to be a libertarian, and it's a wonderful position if everybody behaved.
Yeah.
But the presumption of libertarianism is that everybody is going to be a person with moral character who will do the right thing when given the choice. And we're not going to steal, we're not going to cheat, we're not going to lie. Well, I'm sorry, but human frailty and what you and I might call the sin nature would tell us that's not the way it's going to end up being. We'll just be maybe better thieves the better educated we are.
Governor, let me move into some deeper constitutional waters here. I want to talk with you about the 14th Amendment and its applicability to some moral issues, especially the issue of the sanctity of human life. The amendment, of course, was enacted after the Civil War to provide protection for the recently freed slaves and their descendants, whom the Republicans, who were, of course, the ones pressing for the protection in the 14th Amendment after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. They wanted to provide an amendment that would empower Congress to protect the most fundamental rights that people have. And so the 14th Amendment says, for example, in the first section, No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny any person within their jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. But then if we move down to the fifth section of the 14th Amendment, we find there a specific grant of power to the Congress by appropriate legislation, I'm quoting there, by appropriate legislation, to enforce the guarantees of the article, including the due process and equal protection guarantees of the first section. So my question is, would you read the 14th Amendment as empowering Congress to act to protect the basic right to life of the child in the womb under the equal protection guarantee? Or do you think, as many think, some Republicans as well think, that no, we can't do that because the Supreme Court has given a definitive interpretation of the 14th Amendment to do the opposite of what I'm suggesting here, that is to protect a so-called right to abortion. And so in order to protect the unborn child, we're going to have to wait until either the Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade, or we get a constitutional amendment, which we fought for many years, so far unsuccessfully, to overturn Roe versus Wade. Can we act, or do we have to wait?
I think we can act. And I think we have been derelict as pro-life people for the past 42 years by not recognizing that the power already exists within the Constitution we have, rather than one we think we have to amend. That's why I'm a little concerned when someone says, I'll introduce a constitutional amendment, and they deep down know that's happy talk and fairy dust, that it's years and years away, and that the political battles for that would be extraordinary. I think what we need to recognize is that both the 14th, and I also think the 5th Amendment that says we can't deprive persons their life and liberty without due process, but both of these amendments give us a sound, solid basis to recognize the personhood of the unborn child.
Yeah,
that's really the fundamental question. Is this a person, or is it a blob of tissue? Now, maybe in 1973, maybe it was confused enough and the science was still so fluid that it was hard to determine exactly at what point this fetus became a human being. But I think now, as we know about the genome, as we know about DNA, as we know about 23 male, 23 female chromosomes coming together, that the DNA imprint of that individual at the moment of conception is the same DNA imprint that that person will carry on for the rest of his or her life. If that person lives to be 90, it'll be the exact same DNA imprint that they had at conception. This is scientific, I think, irrefutable evidence that this is now a separate life, distinct from the mother, distinct from the father, unique in itself. It's a person. Now, even if you argue that it's not a person until there's a heartbeat, or it's not a person until it feels pain, and some people will make those arguments, it's inarguable, irrefutable, that this is a life. It's a person, and it's a human person, because it'll never become a dolphin. It'll never become a stalk of broccoli. The only life that it will be is a human life. I'm convinced that one of the mistakes we've made is we have played to the left, and we have accepted this notion of judicial supremacy. Well, the courts have ruled, and it's the law of the land. I hear this all the time. But Dr. George, the courts can't make law. They can review it, they can interpret it, but they can't make it. That's legislation, and that power is exclusively designated for the Congress, the people's elected representatives. I believe the executive branch, for the past 70 years, has essentially surrendered its duty and responsibility to this notion of judicial supremacy, and surrendered the power of the executive branch to the judiciary, which is foolish and frankly stunning. So
you mean the act of surrendering?
The surrendering
to,
not and just throwing up your hands.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
but to just assume there's nothing we can do about this now, unless we pass a constitutional amendment, unless this ruling is overruled. The ruling in and of itself was illegal, unconstitutional, and without basis, because there's nothing in the Constitution that speaks of the origins of life. There's nothing in the Constitution that speaks of abortion as a specific surgical procedure. For the Supreme Court to reach out and create Roe v. Wade was in itself a decision, much like the same-sex marriage decision, that was political in nature, not legal. And it would appear that because we've surrendered to it, now it's become the tradition and people have accepted it. But we shouldn't. This is one of the great ways that we can prove that we are a civilized people, not a savage nation, that we don't destroy the most vulnerable, the weakest among us, the unborn, those who are in what should be the safest place for a human being, the womb of the mother, should not be subjected to a brutal and savage dismembering for someone's convenience, and even more shocking, as we've seen with the Planned Parenthood videos, the dismembering of human being parts so that they can be sold at auction like they were parts to a car. But in all of these things, I do believe that the next president should invoke the 5th and 14th Amendments and should declare that this is the responsibility of government to protect all persons. And as surely as we would protect every person of color, every person of a disability, we will also protect the unborn persons. Now, I know full well that that would let loose a torrent of legal activity. There would be marches on Washington. Fine. But at that point forward, instead of those of us who are pro-life operating from the defensive position of trying to save a baby, we turn this issue on its head, and now those who wish to abort babies will have to go to court and prove that they have a right to kill the baby. That's a ground I'd much rather defend.
And you invoke both the 5th and 14th Amendments because, for our viewers, the 5th Amendment applies to the federal government.
Yes,
and
the 14th
it imposes
to the states.
And the 14th Amendment to the states, and they both impose a duty at each level of government to not deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the 14th Amendment has something additional, and that's the equal protection clause.
Which we don't have under the current abortion laws. There's not an equal protection.
There's not equal protection. Certainly the unborn are not being protected. And you know, Governor, as you just pointed out, the basis of our knowledge of the human status of the child in the womb from the very earliest embryonic stage, from the point at fertilization or conception when we have a distinct organism with its own genetic constitution, its own epigenetic structure. Our knowledge of that does not come from Scripture or from the teachings of the patristic fathers of the Church or from the Vatican or from anything else in the realm of religion, which is not to say that religion doesn't have important things to say about these issues, but this knowledge of the human status of the child in the womb is derived entirely from science.
Yes.
And our friends on the other side of this issue simply don't want to face up to that, do they?
No, they
want to
don't.
say that there's some mystery about when life begins. But if you read any basic text of human embryology and teratology or human developmental biology, you realize that we certainly do know. Science has cracked this one, and we do know that from the earliest embryonic stage we have a new living member of the human species, a human being.
Well, and I find it interesting that the left always wants to say to us that the science of climate change is settled. That's settled science, even though it isn't, and scientists are all over the board on this issue. But if they want to argue that science ought to be the ultimate decision maker of these major decisions, then I've always said to them, and I've had many discussions, when someone in a town hall brings up climate change and says, the science is settled, I say, well, it actually isn't. But let me tell you something the science is settled on. The science is settled on human life and when it begins. Yeah. Are you a pro-life person? And most of the time they will say, well, no, I think a woman has a right to choose. Whoa, excuse me. I thought we were having a scientific discussion, not a philosophical one, because your argument is philosophical, it is political, it is not scientific. If we really want to argue it strictly from the science, divorce ourselves from the emotions, from the theology, from the philosophy, get right down to science, it's hard to argue that inside that mother's womb is anything less than a human being, a person. And if you want to try to argue that, you're going to have to argue with some scientists that are going to look at you with a very quizzical look. But how do you come to that conclusion that this person is not really a person after all?
Yeah, there's no question now, as a matter of scientific fact, we have a human being from the very beginning. And I think the only question is, are we going to respect the principle set forth in the Declaration of Independence, as you indicated earlier, that all men are created equal, all human beings are of equal worth and dignity, or are we going to divide the world into classes of superior human beings and inferior human beings and relegate the unborn or perhaps the elderly by euthanasia or the cognitively disabled to the status of human non-persons or second-class human beings or third-class human beings? I hope that we do honor get back to honoring our basic civilizational commitment and political commitment to the equal dignity of each and every member of the human family.
When I speak to audiences about the life movement, I try not to make it an emotional and even, accusatory argument, because that's inflammatory. What I want to do is make people think through this. And one of the things I ask them, I want to know, do you believe that every human being has intrinsic worth and value? Yes or no? I mean, either you do or you don't. If you do believe, then do you believe that every person is of equal worth and value? Do you think that the captain of the football team is actually worth more to us as a society than the child with Down syndrome? Because if you do, then that's a position that you can take, but you need to defend it. Most of us are appalled to think that a person is better than another because he's rich, because he has a better last name, because he comes from a better heritage, because he's better educated, because he's white, because he's
stronger,
gifted
prettier,
or talented.
whatever, yeah.
I said, we're on dangerous ground here when we start evaluating the intrinsic worth. I said, none of us deep down want to admit that we think that that's a legitimate argument. If we do, then our next conclusion is that some people are expendable and disposable because we want to make it possible for those who we don't deem to be expendable and disposable to have more room. And I said, that's a dangerous ground. And when we've seen this in human history, past times, that story never ended well.
Yeah.
So if now we've established that, then let's come to the conclusion that what is the basis for our decision? Is it financial hardship and or social disruption? Because the two arguments for abortion on demand are financial hardship and social disruption. I can't afford the baby. This is really going to mean that my life will never be the same. I can't finish law school. My boyfriend will leave me. My mother will hate me. Social disruptions. Once we've determined that these are legitimate reasons to take the human life, then what we've established now is a whole new norm for evaluating the worth of a human life. And here's what I ask people. If we establish at the beginning of the spectrum of life that ending that life is acceptable for financial hardship or social disruption, let's move that principle to the other end of the spectrum. And now you have your 85-year-old grandmother. She's in long-term care. She has Alzheimer's, the early stages. That's a financial hardship. And that's definitely a social disruption, because if you're going to help be even a part-time caretaker, now we've decided that, we're just going to have to take grandma out. And I've asked audiences, are you okay with that? And I never have found an audience where the people applauded and said, yes, I think that's a great idea, because they know that they're going to be on the receiving end of the needle. That's why I believe we have to approach this with common sense and with logic, and just help people walk through and come to the logical conclusion of what abortion on demand, which we have now, where it leads us. It leads us.
And that argument that you just developed makes no reference to revealed religion, to
None
God
at all.
or anything.
That's right. This isn't an argument saying, look, you have to love Jesus Christ and you have to accept God as I do. No, let's just look at it from a strictly
scientific and philosophical point of view. Governor, I need to move on, but let me move into something you've already raised, a very important issue, this question of judicial power.
Yes.
And whether we should or should not embrace the idea of judicial supremacy. Obviously, the Supreme Court can get things wrong. Everybody agrees.
Yes.
I've yet to meet anybody who believes that the Supreme Court is infallible. It's not infallible. We all agree on that. So it gets some things wrong. Throughout our history, it's gotten some things terribly wrong.
Dred
Before
Scott
the Civil
decision.
War, yes,
Yeah.
you bring up the Dred Scott decision. That, for our viewers, was the decision in the mid-1850s that struck down efforts by Congress to restrict slavery in the federal territories of the United States, creating essentially a right to slavery, even outside the southern states that had slavery, in the federal territories. It also held that blacks, even free blacks in the northern states, could not be citizens and have the right of citizens. Abraham Lincoln, when he was running for Senate in 1858 in Illinois, in his great debates with Stephen Douglas, denounced that decision, said it was an anti-constitutional decision. It should be rejected. It should be overturned. And then when he won the presidency and was sworn in March of 1861, the inauguration in those days was a couple of months later, it was in March, Lincoln addressed the Dred Scott decision, just as we might address Roe versus Wade or the Obergefell decision, the same-sex marriage decision. Lincoln addressed that decision, and he said, I recognize the position held by some that the Supreme Court gets the final say on these things, but we cannot accept that. To do that, to treat the rule as binding, on the other branches of government when the decision lacks any basis in the Constitution would be to resign our government into the hands of that eminent tribunal,
Yes.
to give up the very idea of Republican, or what we might call democratic government, and create a judicial oligarchy ruled by unelected judges. And when Lincoln became president, when he got the administration up and going, he defied that ruling. He supported legislation, signed into law a bill that restricted slavery in the federal territories, and in defiance of the court's edict that blacks could not be treated as citizens, he granted passports to black citizens. He issued patents to black inventors. He simply refused, as the head of a co-equal branch of government, to bow before the idea of judicial supremacy. Yet, Governor, in our own time, this idea of judicial supremacy has become a sort of orthodoxy. So my question to you is, was Lincoln right? Should we reject judicial supremacy? Or, as much as we may dislike some of these decisions, are they in fact what some of those who are competing with you for the presidency, for the nomination of your party for the presidency, say, it's the law of the land?
I think when people say it's the law of the land, there's nothing we can do unless we amend the Constitution, it's a cowardly approach. It's also an unconstitutional approach, because it defies the notion that most of us learned in ninth grade civics. There are three branches of government. Those are equal branches of government. There's a separation of powers, and within those three branches of government, separated from each other but equal to each other, there is check and balance. And if one of the branches overreaches, it is not just the right, it is the responsibility, the duty of the other branches to check that out of control branch. We've had for the past 70 or so years a very different approach to Supreme Court decisions than we had for the first 180 years of our country's history. And Jefferson and Jackson and Madison and Adams and Lincoln all were very clear that the court can't make law. They were very clear that the courts can certainly review and interpret, but it still requires the other two branches of government to put it into effect, because Congress has the power of the purse, the executive branch has the power of the sword, the judicial branch has neither. And it depends upon the goodwill of the other two branches and their assent to that in order for it to be operative. And
so for an anti-constitutional decision, an illegitimate decision such as the Obergefell decision,
Yes.
which, as the dissenters pointed out, the four dissenting justices, just
Brilliantly,
has
by the
no
way.
basis in
Yeah.
the text or logic or structure or historical understanding of the Constitution. For a decision like that, would you as president simply decline to enforce that
I
decision?
would absolutely decline. In fact, I would make sure that I had an Attorney General who led the Justice Department, who would protect in every way the rights of those citizens who joined in disagreeing. I just find it amazing that we would ever surrender not just the executive and legislative branches, but we essentially would surrender the entire government of the United States to what John Roberts so brilliantly labeled 5 unelected lawyers. You know, there are times I've disagreed with John Roberts, maybe on the Obamacare decision.
Sure.
But my gosh, when I read his dissent on the same-sex marriage decision, it was one of the most powerful, riveting, and revealing dissents, I think, perhaps ever. And for a Chief Justice to refer repeatedly to his colleagues on the Supreme Court, and a good friend of mine, a constitutional scholar, Matt Staver, who was dean of the law school at Liberty University for many years, made the comment, he said, that in all of the history of the Supreme Court, never has a Chief Justice repeatedly referred to his colleagues as 5 unelected lawyers. He would at least refer to them with the respectful delineation of my esteemed colleagues or my fellow justices, some way of, he showed them contempt, not respect, by always referring to them over and over as 5 unelected lawyers. And he and Scalia, Alito and Thomas all made it very clear that this decision was outside the bounds of the Constitution and law, outside the boundaries of their authority, because there was nothing in the Constitution that they could hang their hat on and say, we have the right to define marriage. And it's a matter of saving our republic to say that as president, we're not going to accept this decision. We will ignore it. We will not enforce it. And in fact, if a state has same-sex marriage by the vote of its people, then we will respect it because we
that's
have to.
They have the constitutional authority.
They
the
have
states
the
have the
constitutional
constitutional
authority
authority.
to do
They
that.
could introduce polygamy right?
could.
They could, and that would be perfectly within their constitutional
I wouldn't like
authority.
it,
Wouldn't
but I would
like
have
it?
to respect
No.
it. Under the 10th Amendment, you'd have to say they were within their bounds.
But this has to be a matter of principle, doesn't it? So that
Yes.
for our liberal friends, they have some decisions they don't like as well. The gun control decisions that have defended our Second Amendment in a robust interpretation of the right to bear arms. Citizens United, the campaign finance case. If, let's say, President Obama, who believes that the campaign finance case is wrong, that it's not rooted in the Constitution, that it's an illegitimate decision, if he refused to enforce it, we would have to say that's within his authority as well. We might disagree with him on the substance of the decision, but if we're not to be hypocrites here, don't we have to say that if he made that choice, then of course it would be up to the American people to respond politically as to whether they thought he was doing the right thing in standing up to the court or not. But we couldn't criticize him for lawlessness, could we?
Well, no, but here's what we could do. I mean, this is the genius of our Constitution, and every now and then I just stand back in awe. I really do. I mean, I believe the Bible is divinely inspired, and I don't think the Constitution's on the same level as the Scriptures. But I can't read the Constitution, particularly as I understand it in context of how it is played out, and not be in awe of the sheer brilliance that our founders understood that we are frail. Now, we would say it in the maybe the biblical tradition, we're sinners. I know that's politically incorrect, but that we have a basic nature that is not perfect.
G.K. Chesterton said that original sin is the only Christian doctrine for which there is empirical evidence that's overwhelming.
Well, there is definitely evidence for that. But because we understood that we're frail, that we would make mistakes, that we were corruptible, we created three branches so that if one got out of control, the other two had the power to check it.
It's the system of checks and balances.
That's exactly right. So that's why it's so important that the president not surrender to the courts. It's also important that the Congress and the courts not surrender to the president. So if the president is out of control, Congress has the power to impeach. The Congress has the power
to deny funding.
To deny funding
to certain institutions.
Absolutely. They have the power of the purse to withhold.
For example, defunding Planned Parenthood is something Congress is working on.
That's exactly right. It's messy. It's not always pretty.
But it's politics. Yeah, it's the system.
The system is designed for self-correction. But it has to be led by people who swim in their lane, understand the unique constitutional duty, and I use that word with emphasis, the constitutional duty they have to provide that check and balance to the other branches. If they fail to do that, then we begin to unravel the very foundation of our constitutional republic.
Governor, on to another very important constitutional and moral issue. The Catholic bishops have expressed, as have many religious leaders of all faiths around the country, grave concern about the state of religious liberty in this country. It seems to be coming under assault from all sorts of different directions, from the federal government, sometimes from the states, our Catholic adoption agencies, for example, as well as, I believe, the adoption agencies of some other traditions, such as the Lutherans, have been, in some jurisdictions, simply driven out of providing adoption services because, as Christian institutions, they insist on providing orphan children with both a mother and a father, a home with both a mother and a father. And of course, some states in the District of Columbia object to that, want to impose on them an obligation to place children with same-sex headed households. As Christians, they cannot do that, so as a result, they can't be licensed. That looks to me like a very, very powerful assault on the basic religious liberty of Catholics, Lutherans, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, others, and we see the same thing with photographers and other suppliers of services for weddings. We're seeing the same thing in some places where there are efforts to force nurses to participate in abortions, or doctors to perform or at least refer for abortions. What can we do? What should we do? What would you do as President of the United States to protect our fundamental religious liberty against these assaults?
Well, I've outlined it on several occasions and written about this on my website, MikeHuckabee.com. And here's what I would do. I'd, first of all, make sure I had an Attorney General who understood his constitutional duty as what I, as President, and we would protect the First Amendment rights of every American. That would mean that if a photographer had a conscientious religious objection to photographing a same-sex marriage, rather than go and to stand with the local government in fining her are putting her out of business, we would go and use the full resources of the Justice Department and the federal government to protect her religious liberty. Same thing true would be a caterer or a Christian school. If the administrator of a Christian university says we don't provide student housing for same-sex couples, they would, under today's kind of society, they'd get sued. We would go on the side and defend them. We would make sure that every chaplain in the military, every military member in uniform, were allowed to carry a Bible, were allowed to pray. Chaplains could counsel people according to the dictates of their faith and conscience rather than according to the dictates of the government. The one thing about the First Amendment that ought to be so sacred to us is that it is a restriction, not upon me as an individual believer. The restriction is on the government. And this is the case with every one of the Bill of Rights. And sometimes I just wonder, have we read those lately? Did we go back and read? Because in every case, it tells the government what it can't do to take my freedom away, whether they can't come in my house and quarter and live there.
That's the Third Amendment?
Yeah, they can't just come in and look around because they thought they might want to find something.
Fourth Amendment, that's right.
They can't tell a newspaper that it can't publish something. First Amendment, they can't tell several of us that we can't gather together.
It is a bunch of thou shalt nots that are directed to the government.
To the government. Yeah. It empowers me as a citizen. It guarantees my rights, and it restricts the government. What we're seeing today is a government that is restricting the rights of individuals, where it's a county clerk in Kentucky, or whether it's Baronel Stutzman, the florist up in Washington State, or whether it's Melissa and Aaron Klein, the caterers in Oregon. We see this over and over. And here's one of the things that I find most ironic. I've been to Guantanamo. I've been to Gitmo, and I've observed the way in which we detain suspected terrorists there.
The most hardcore of the
most hardcore. These are not people that are there for singing too loud in church last Sunday. These people are either there because they killed Americans or plotted to kill Americans. These are bad people. I went there, and the first thing I noticed was what an unbelievably modern and well-appointed detainee center that we have there. My prison director was with me at the time, and we looked at each other and we said, I hope none of our inmates ever see this place. They'll all want to transfer. But the lengths to which we went to accommodate the Muslim detainees, painting arrows in their cells so they would know which way they needed to paint
for praying,
toward Mecca. We gave them prayer rugs. 5 times a day they could stop whatever they were doing and have their prayers. We provided them special halal meals that cost 3 times what the meals cost that we provided to the soldiers who were guarding these people. It was unbelievable, the level of accommodation that we went to. Now, my point is, if we can accommodate suspected murderers of Americans who are detained for warring against this country, are you honestly going to tell me that we cannot find a way to accommodate and account for the religious convictions of an elected county clerk in Kentucky who instead was put in jail, which I don't think people,
Would you agree, Governor, that all faiths need to be treated equally? In other words, it's not a matter of taking rights away from Muslim citizens or Mormon citizens or Orthodox Jewish citizens, that all faiths should get the same respect for religious freedom that our law actually, under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, for example, requires.
In fact, I was conducting a town hall in Iowa, of all places, not long ago, and a person stood up and said, you've talked about religious liberty. Well, I'm an atheist. Will you protect my liberty? And I know that, the person was saying this thinking I was going to say, well, you should be a Christian. And I said, absolutely, I would protect your view. I may not agree with it, but you have every right to be a non-believer, as I have the right to be a believer.
That's the First Amendment, too. That's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
And the
Governor, I need to move on to, but before we move away from religious liberty, I know our viewers want to know, would you prioritize passage of the FADA, the First Amendment Defense Act, which would protect people against discrimination or persecution by government based on their belief that marriage is the union of a man and a woman? Would that be, in a Huckabee presidency, part of your first 100 days?
Yes, because I think it's something that ought to be low-hanging fruit. Not that it would be. I think it would be a battle. But it ought to be fairly easy to convince the American public that you're not creating something new, not a new right. You're simply wanting to codify the existing right that we have in the Constitution.
Governor, the Obama administration has issued a new ruling requiring every public school in America to give biological males who identify as females, think that they're females, access to girls' shower rooms, bathrooms, dressing areas, and so forth. The administration threatens school districts, like one out in Illinois, with the loss of federal funding if they do not let the boys or men into the girls' or women's facilities. Hundreds of boys and girls walked out of school in Hillsborough High School in Missouri to protest that what they regarded and I regard as an invasion of their privacy. Now, this is happening at a time when many other parents are upset by the way federal funding was used to ram curriculum changes, the Common Core, down the throats of people in 46 states. What will you do as president to protect people against having their daughters be put in shower rooms where biological males are permitted to be present? What would you do to stem this growing misuse of regulations and funding to force this kind of an agenda down the throats of the American people?
Well, one thing the president can do is you have the control over the executive agencies, whether it's the Department of Education, the Department of Human Services, and also the Justice Department. And you make sure that everyone understands that you are not going to create this ludicrous notion that a person can just wake up one day and say, you know I have the biological makeup of a male, and I have the gene. I'm genetically male, but I kind of feel feminine today, or I'm going to feel feminine for the next year or the rest of my life.
Or I have felt this my entire life.
Whatever they
or
feel.
Whatever, yeah.
I don't care. You're biologically a male, and you don't have the right to go in and expose yourself to females. And I'm of all the things that we've been dealing with over the past few years in our culture, whether it's the sanctity of life and the definition of marriage, frankly, this one is the most baffling to me, that people, educated, thoughtful people, would, with a straight face, defend the notion that it is normal, that it is perfectly legitimate for a person just to declare oneself to be a different gender. I mean, it borders on laughable, and I know to say it's laughable would bring great contempt because people say you're being insensitive. I'm not being insensitive. I'm exercising just a little bit of common sense.
Yeah, I myself believe the body dysphorias that people experience are very real and they're very painful, and I think people who experience them should be treated with compassion and with care. And it doesn't matter what the dysphoria is. I mean, there are many different body dysphorias. Some people feel
alienated. But you would be condemned for
from
calling it a dysphoria.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Because
it's politically incorrect.
You've now just declared that it's not normal, and those who defend this as absolutely normal are driving the discussion today, and I find that troubling.
You'll know what I mean, and I think our viewers will know what I mean when I say it looks to me like what we've got here is a revival of the ancient heresy known as Gnosticism. The idea that we're not unities of body and soul, or body, mind, and spirit, but rather we're spirits or minds merely inhabiting bodies. The body and the mind are so separate that the body could be one thing and the mind or spirit could be another thing. Christianity faced this all the way back in the 2nd century. Irenaeus wrote against it in his work against heresies, and of course it was defeated as far as Christian orthodoxy is concerned. And we as Christians believe that the body and mind, or body and soul, are united. That's why, for example, we believe that Jesus rose bodily from the dead, and that there will be a bodily resurrection for all of us. But if you have this separation of body and person, or body and spirit, or body and mind, then suddenly it makes sense to imagine that I'm one thing psychologically, female, and another thing biologically, male. But it looks to me like a terrible error that has revived itself in our time.
But it still defies, and let's go back to what we talked about earlier. If liberals want to say we've got to let science lead us, okay, let's let science lead us. There's a difference biologically between a male and a female. Now, we can also...
all the way down to the chromosomes.
Exactly.
It's a chromosomal difference.
That's exactly right. And that chromosomal difference determines whether we're male or female.
Although there are rare cases of chromosome abnormalities.
But you just hit the magic word, abnormalities. Those are not considered the norm. They're considered the abnormal. We also have the biblical record, which I know you can't inject that into maybe the policy discussion, but for purposes of looking at this from a society civilization standpoint, the Bible clearly says male and female, He created them. So there is a distinction, a difference between male and female. It's not interchangeable.
Well, there, of course, what all the Bible is doing is presenting as revealed truth an insight that is captured not uniquely by the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition that came from it, but by civilizations really across the world. Governor, the Catholic Church teaches, and I don't think that Baptists disagree, but you can tell me, that there's what the Catholic tradition calls a preferential option for the poor. That is the idea that in looking at our public policy, the weakest, most vulnerable members of the community have to be given a certain priority. Their interests have to be looked at first. When we have a proposed policy, for example, the first question we should ask is, what will its impact be on, say, the unborn or the mentally or physically handicapped or disabled, or those who are mired in poverty? Now, we do know that policies of the sort that benefit people who are already well off often benefit the less well off as well by improving general prosperity and providing much needed job opportunities for people. But what can we do, what would a Huckabee administration do to help the still millions and millions of Americans and people abroad, but let's focus now on our own country, who are in fact mired in poverty? Do you believe there is a preferential option for the poor?
Well, I do, and it doesn't defy the notion of equality, because equality still is there, but you're also recognizing that if there are two houses beside each other and one's on fire and the other isn't, the fire department goes to the one that's on fire.
And there's no violation of equality.
There's no violation of equality. You don't go pour water on one that's not burning. So I look at this, that's the argument to say that preferential is not somehow violating someone else's right. It's just recognizing this is the house on fire, this is the one that's going to get the water. So if you have people who do not have food, who do not have shelter, people who do not have health care, is there a preferential idea that their house is on fire? That's where the fire truck needs to go. Yes. So when I was governor, for example, I've got a long history of this, and it's not something for me in the abstract. There was a higher proportion of African Americans in our state with hypertension, with diabetes, but they lived geographically in the most underserved medical communities of our state, mostly in East Arkansas, where jobs had migrated to the northwest part of the state, the far more prosperous part of the state at that time, the impoverished part of the state. So we put disproportionate resources for community health care clinics, to bring nurse practitioners, to bring every kind of availability, health coaches into those communities. The result was that we saw changes in those patterns of hypertension and diabetes and started seeing better health outcomes. I could also say to you that when we dealt with welfare reform back in the mid-90s, and I was governor during the time when Congress empowered states to do it, one thing we quickly learned was that our welfare system was not designed to get people out. Our welfare system was designed to keep people in, because there is an industry of poverty in this country. And I know this is going to shock some people, and they may be surprised to hear it, but there are programs and entities and agencies that have grown up making money servicing the poor. But their real goal is not getting people out of poverty, because then they would go out of business. Their goal is to make sure that they continue to become the funnel through which government money flows, and they provide enough resources to keep people in their poverty.
So people are victimized by dependency.
They're utterly victimized. The government programs often lock people in their hole rather than help them get out. And
so would you agree then that what we have here between the left and the right is not what we have on some other issues such as abortion or marriage, a difference in fundamental values? At least for people at their best, what we have is a difference of views about what the best means are to solve the problem. We who are on the conservative side, we who are Christians, believe as much as liberal secularists in the need to fight poverty. But we don't think their programs have done a very good job of that, and we think there's a better way to do it.
Well, we've spent $2 trillion since 1965 when we declared war on poverty. The poverty rate's the same as it was 50 years ago. But here's what we can do that would make it different. Under the current program, there is an arbitrary threshold at which people either receive or don't receive certain benefits, whether it's WIC or food stamps or Section 8 housing. All of these programs are designed so that You get Medicaid, but as soon as you hit this income threshold, you lose Medicaid. Well, what we've ended up creating is we've created this barrier so that if there is, let's say, a single mom with 2 kids, we will provide her with an extraordinary level of benefits that will help her live not wonderfully, but at least decently within the context of all of those housing, medical, and maybe nutritional programs that will help her. If she goes and gets a job and she starts earning money and she earns right over $1 over that threshold, she loses all of those benefits.
Well,
so
then she's disincentivized from
totally
actually doing that.
And then it's not, I hear people say, well, she's lazy. No, she's not lazy. She's smarter than the people who designed those stupid programs.
Well, presumably she cares about her kids.
Absolutely,
if she thinks going to work is actually going to damage her.
I applaud her. I don't condemn her. I applaud her because she's got more sense than the government entities who created.
We need a better approach.
A stair-step approach, and here's how it should work.
Well, Governor, I've got to move on to the next question, believe it or not, but you and I will talk offline because I'm so interested in that. But I want to move to immigration, a terribly important issue for our country. We're a nation of immigrants, and our nation has benefited profoundly, in my view, from immigration over the entire lifetime of the nation, millions and millions, and not just rich people or people who already have a good education and talents to contribute, but even sometimes people who came from poverty, like my own ancestors on my mother's side from southern Italy, coming with nothing and not very well educated, have still made profound contributions to the American order. Now, the Catholic bishops have long favored a program of comprehensive immigration reform that would combine a generous welcoming policy for legal immigrants with humane treatment, avoiding mass deportations and separation of families and so forth for those who did come here unlawfully. Do you agree with the bishops about those 2 goals, humane treatment for those who are here unlawfully and a generous policy of immigration? Or do you agree with those who say, no, we should have more limited or no immigration because those immigrants are taking jobs from Americans and we do need to deport as a mass those who are here unlawfully?
I don't think it's realistic or even affordable for us to consider a mass deportation. I'm not sure how that logistically would work or how financially we would even begin to cover it. I do think we ought to have control of our borders, and I don't think that there is a disparity between our responsibility to control our borders and to know who's coming, why they're coming, what they're going to do when they get here, and are they coming to make America greater, or are they coming here to put a shoulder-fired rocket against an airliner taken off at LAX. I think we have every responsibility to protect our citizens, which means we protect our borders. I don't think that's in conflict with the notion that America has always been the melting pot. We've been a place that welcomed people. I think we get wrapped up in how many people are coming. What we need to be asking is, why are you coming? If you're coming here because you believe that America offers opportunity and freedom and you want to taste that, experience that, live that, pass that to your kids and embrace that, then we'll probably find a place for you because you'll make this a better country. Mm-hmm. If you're coming because you've heard we give you free food, free health care, free education for your kids, and then you can start bringing your family members and we'll do the same for them, then I think we have to say, you know, right now there's no room in the inn. We're kind of broke here. We got $20 trillion of debt going on, and a lot of Americans out of work, and 5 million manufacturing jobs lost in the years since 2000. It's not a one thing, and one big lesson I learned as governor is you never treat any issue in an isolation. You treat it as an integration of all of those issues together. Why are people so upset about the immigration policies? Because they feel that immigration is threatening their livelihood, their way of life, what they have worked for. So if we had an economy that was growing and working, we would be in a place where we're saying, we got to get some more labor in here. Mm-hmm. You know, rather than say, we got to get these people out, we'd be saying, we got to get some people in. That changes the dynamic. So what we've done is we focus on the fruit of the problem, not the root of the problem. I would secure the border. I think that's first and foremost, because I don't think a lot of Americans are ever going to believe anything we do about immigration reform
until they know we're secure. Sure.
That's right. Yeah. And frankly, I don't blame them. I think they're right.
Yeah, these are not bigots. These are not people who just don't want immigrants. There are lots of people who would like a generous immigration policy, but want it to be an orderly policy and want the border to be secure.
And I don't think most Americans favor a blanket amnesty where you just say, hey, you know what, everybody, we're cool with your being here. But you don't want to make it so punitive that you punish people, because what in many cases people did when they came here illegally, they came illegally because our federal government was such a disastrous failure in creating immigration policies to come legally that it took 18 years and tens of thousands of dollars.
Oh, yeah.
So you can't afford
and of course,
to do that.
in many cases, you had businesses, sometimes large agribusinesses,
right.
who were exploiting
Yes.
illegal labor. The people who came here unlawfully, in some ways, of course, are victims of that exploitation.
They have been exploited. One reason that I support the fair tax, which is a tax on consumption rather than
income,
on income, is because you change the dynamics of the whole process of illegal immigration. We have illegal immigration in part because employers find it very profitable. Not only can they underpay the worker, they can pay him $8 an hour instead of $12, and the worker still nets more money because there's nothing taken out of his check. But in addition to the employer underpaying and exploiting the labor that way, he's not paying in the employer portion of the payroll tax, so he gets another bonus for hiring illegals. And we need to address that issue. We've always put it on the back of the guy picking tomatoes or making beds. I'm thinking, why didn't we put it on the backs and let's also recognize that the other side of that equation is the employer who is exploiting the labor and making a lot of money by participating. And by the way, that's why a lot of Republicans don't want to fix this, because the Republican donors know they're making a lot of money off illegal immigration, and they want to keep it that way.
Got to change. Got to change.
It does.
Thank you, viewers, for being part of our Candidate Conversations 2016. I hope you'll join us for the next one. And thank you, Governor Mike Huckabee. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been an honor. Thank you very much, Dr. George.